A term you'd hear bandied around a lot in knitting is knitting flat versus knitting in the round. Knitting flat is where you're knitting back and forth, so you're doing a knit row, maybe a purl row, and you're knitting that back and forth between your two needles. Knitting in the round is where you are creating your knitting as a tube of knitting, essentially. And you can do that in different sizes of circumference. So in this piece that I'm holding up now, that's been knit in the round. So it's a single piece that you create in knitting that is kind of double-sided, essentially. And it's used for lots of different reasons. So for sweaters, cowls, hats, all sorts of different reasons. And it's just a slightly different style. What we're going to do in this video is we're going to explore the differences that there are when you are knitting in the round versus knitting flat, how to get started with knitting in the round, and kind of things to look out for when you're doing it. To be candid though, it is exactly the same as knitting, just maybe a little bit more peaceful. There are a number of different needle types for working in the round, so it's not possible to work in the round on a pair of straight knitting needles, so you need special needles for working in the round. So the first type of needle that you'll often see people using are double pointed needles. Double pointed needles come in different lengths, so 10 centimeter, 16 centimeter, 20 centimeter, and they allow you to do different sizes of circumference in the round. Over the last number of years, short circumference needles have existed, so these are short circular needles. So you see these in 20, 25, 30 centimeter lengths, and they often have shorter tip lengths as well. And that's to mean that you can make a very small circumference in the round. You'll see here I have an interchangeable needle where one is longer than the other, and these kinds of needles are often used for sleeves and socks. The type you use will be entirely your preference, and you'll try many different methods over time. The next thing for working in the round are long circular needles. So long circular needles come in different lengths as well. So you will have 40, 50, 60, 80, 100 and 150 centimeter long circular needles. And every time you're doing a different size circumference, you may want a different size of needle. So for example, if I'm knitting a sweater, I might need an 80 centimeter for the top of it, but if I want to make it flare at the bottom, I might need an 100 centimeter. You'll also see other techniques as well for using different types of needles. So for example, you can use a very long circular needle to do a technique called magic loop, which allows you to do very small circumferences in the round. And you'll also see brand new out in the last couple of years are the Addi Crazy Trios, which are a set of 3 needles for doing work in the round. As with many knitting projects, the first thing to do often when working in the round is to cast on. So it is exactly the same as if you were casting on straight needles, except that in this case you're going to be using the tips of the needles on either end of your long circular needle, or you're going to be using your double pointed needles. And we will look further at casting onto double pointed needles later on. So as you'll see here, I'm just doing a regular cable cast on from one needle to the other. Now, this is a short tipped needle, so it's a 40 centimeter. And in this case, it can be useful to use an additional needle to cast on the stitches. In this case, I'm using another 4mm needle, a double pointed, just to get the stitches on to the needle. And I sometimes do this when I'm using a shorter circular needle because it's a little bit more comfortable, because you're less constrained by the cable between the two needles. This is less of a concern if you're using a 60 plus length cable, so centimeter long cable, because you've plenty more cable to do it with. But it's just a little tip that I find useful. Once you've cast on your stitches, the next thing that differs obviously when working in the round is you need to join your stitches to work in the round. So the first thing is that you don't want your yarn on your left hand side like you would if you were knitting flat. You want it in your right hand side because you're going to join one end to the other now that you've cast on. So the first thing you want to do as well is you want to make sure that your stitches aren't twisted. So I'll show you what that looks like. And that means that your stitches during the cast on have become twisted around. And if you join now, you'll create a Mobius, so it'll never end. And while sometimes that's what you want, a lot of the times it's not. So before you do join, make sure that your stitches are all kind of in single direction and make sure that they're not twisted. And that's the first thing you do when you're joining in the round, regardless of what method you use to join in the round. There are broadly 3 methods of joining in the round. The first thing before you do that as well is you want to make sure that your working yarn, even if your first stitch is a purl stitch, is outside the loop of your needles. And that makes it a little bit more comfortable to work as well, because you don't want to be pulling yarn through the center of your work once you're joined. So the first method of joining in the round is just to start knitting. So what you want to do here before you do that is place a round marker. And again, this is something that's different from working flat, because you need to know where each of your rounds actually starts. So you must make sure that you place a round marker. So once you've done that, you're ready to start knitting. So the first key here is you're going to knit the first stitch you cast on, and it'll be beside the last stitch that you cast on. Now here it's easy to create a small bit of looseness. So when you knit that stitch, make sure that you draw it in together using the tail of the yarn, and also don't allow that to pull out too much, because you'll get a little bit of extra tail in your yarn. So that's something that you have to be quite careful of, is to make sure that you don't get too much gap there. The good news, however, is that if you do, you are going to have to sew in your tail, so you can sew in the tail of your yarn and hide any kind of bumpiness or any issues that you do get at that point. So that's the first method, so you just start knitting. And after a row or two, any unevenness that you do see there can be evened out, will even itself out as well. But do draw the first stitch quite tightly and then continue knitting as normal. And there you have it, you are now joined in the round. And something that people worry about all the time when they start working the round first is that they worry that they're going to have to join every time. And that's not the case. Once you have joined in the round once, and you come to the start of that round again, you will just slip your marker and continue working. So that's it, joined in the round. Another method of joining in the round, if you're a little bit nervous about a gap, is to cast on one extra stitch to the end of your round when you're casting on. Then, as you come to join, slip that extra stitch onto the left-hand needle, so your last stitch cast on goes on beside your first stitch cast on. Then place your marker, and then you knit those two stitches together. And what that does is that anchors one end to the other a little bit better than if you're just going to knit that first stitch. Again, you're going to give that a little bit of a tighten with your tail, and you're going to continue working. This is a personal preference as to which one you use. I like this particular method, and I use this quite a lot. I use my tail then to hide any unevenness by having that extra stitch in there. One thing I would say is, if you are using this method, is to make sure you include the extra stitch after you've cast on the total number of stitches in the cast on. So if the cast on is 60, make sure you cast on 61 and have that extra stitch for doing this, working two together to make sure your join is complete. Another option is to knit a couple of rows, so knit or purl or do the rib depending on the pattern, before you join in the round. And the reason people do this is that sometimes on double pointed needles it can be easier because you have more structure in your knitting, and also it's much easier to see if you've twisted any of them. So that's another option that's open to you as well. So there are a couple of key things to remember when working in the round in terms of stitches. So here I'm knitting what looks like stocking stitch. So if I'm knitting stocking stitch back and forth in rows, I'm knitting a knit row, then I'm working a purl row, working a knit row, working a purl row. However, when I am doing stocking stitch in the round, I am just knitting all of the rows, and that is because the purl bumps all go to the back of the work on a knit round. So there's no purling when doing stocking stitch in the round. The opposite is true of garter stitch. So at garter stitch, I am knitting all round rows if I'm knitting it flat, so I knit a row, knit a row, knit a row. Whereas if I'm working it in the round, I need to knit a row and then purl a row and then knit a row, because I want the bumps, the purl bumps, so the bumps of the backs of the stitches, to come back and forth depending on what I want, so to create that garter stitch look. That's very important. The next thing to remember as well is that when you're working a rib in the round versus working a rib flat. So if I'm working a rib flat, I will be, on one side I will knit my stitches, and on the other side I will purl those stitches to get that rib effect on those particular stitches. When I'm working the same rib in the round, I will always knit the same stitches and purl the same stitches. It doesn't change between rounds like it does between rows when you're knitting a rib. And that's just something to consider in case you ever come to a situation where you're not entirely sure why the stitch pattern is coming out incorrectly. It might be because you do one thing flat and another thing when you're working in the round. Something else that is a little bit odd when you're working in the round as well is that the way in which you hold your yarn may vary. So if I am working a lot in the round, I try to get to a point where I move my stitches around the bottom of the needle to get more of them ready to work. So I will bunch them up. I'm also using my hand to pull up and move them up along the needle as well, which you would do that in ordinary knitting as well. But the main thing is that you're always trying to just very slowly pull your yarn around so that you're not affecting the tension, but you always have stitches coming in. So if I don't do that, this is what happens. So if I don't move my knitting around, and I keep knitting, and I keep knitting, and I keep knitting, it does kind of move it, and actually I can feel my hand pulling the stitches up. I'm doing that automatically because I do it all the time. But if I don't do that, eventually you're working too far down the needle, because it's just something to be conscious of, that you have to move it all the way around, because you're constantly feeding stitches in, whereas when you're working back and forth, you're going to come out and you're going to have them on one needle and you work back and forth. It's just something that you get used to, that you feed. Your hands will eventually start feeding the yarn to yourself as you work in the round. Now, an interesting thing with really short needles, and it's the biggest difference with short needles, is that you have a lot of, like, the circumference is smaller. So the smaller the circumference of the needles, the more effort, the more you need to do this. So I find really useful for that is I do this. So when I'm using a really small needle, where I don't have a lot of grip on my hands can't just automatically feed the yarn to myself, I'll often use this method. So I'll knit 2 stitches, push down, bring up. And what that does is that feeds the needle, it pulls your work towards you a little bit more when you're working in the round. It's just a small tip. It's something I do when I'm working on very small circumstances, and it helps me get a bit of speed and evenness in my tension. The last thing to consider, well, one of the other considerations we'll say, is that when you're working in the round versus working flat, is that your tension is going to change, or it may change. So for example here, where I'm doing stocking stitch in the round, I'm just knitting all my stitches, whereas when I'm working on the flat, I'm knitting and purling and knitting and purling, and those stitches are actually different sizes. And it's something that you need to consider. So if you are knitting something that is going to be knit all in the round, you should swatch in the round. And if you are going to be knitting flat, you should swatch in the flat. And that's just another little thing that is different when working in the round from when you are working flat.